Welcome to all of you who are already connected, and we welcome in advance all those who will join us a bit later. We have a 2-hour session now dedicated to issues raised by researching the construction of urban futures, which seems like an adequate program for a program called Urban Futures. And we started actually a seminar within the LabEx a few months ago, a seminar series. So we had already 2 sessions dedicated to this issue, to studying the epistemological, theoretical, methodological, and even political issues raised by the research on urban futures and their construction, which are, it's our starting argument, increasingly pressing in today's urban research in a context of rising uncertainties and threats, environmental threats, social threats, geopolitical threats, or even, as we well know now, sanitary threats, and also a context with ubiquitous calls for transitions. Ecological transitions, energy transitions, agricultural and food transitions, digital transitions. And in all these concerns, the issue of the future pops up. But the future is not so easy to study, especially for us social scientists, but more generally. And so the idea of the seminar series is to investigate. It will go on during next academic year, hopefully in a less virtual way. So the purpose of this seminar series is to explore different aspects of the questions raised by the scientific study of urban futures and their construction. And today, and I thank them already in advance, we welcome 4 colleagues on this panel to bring complementary perspectives on the study of urban futures, which I will briefly present. But before I do that, I would like to explain briefly how the roundtable is organized, because there are different models of roundtables. So we'll first hear short presentations by each of our panelists, and the idea is that they it will give us a notion, us the audience, a notion of where they speak from, so to speak, and what kind of empirical material and theoretical issues they have in mind when they address the question of urban futures. That would be a first phase, so a short presentation, maybe around 10 minutes each. And after that, I will initiate a sort of conversation between the panelists by picking one specific question raised in each presentation and asking other panelists to reflect on that question. And so hopefully we can have some real conversation, even at a distance, between our panelists, and then we'll have probably something like a half hour, or we'll see when we get there, of a general exchange with the audience. And for that, well, we're not so numerous now, but maybe the number will increase. And anyway, maybe the most efficient way is that you write on the chat to say that you would like to make a comment or ask a question, and you can even specify if you ask a question to all panelists, so I can choose the victim who will respond to you, or if you would like to ask your question to a specific panelist. So that's the program, and we're ending at 4:30. And so now our panelists, there are 4 of them. And the first one, Valeria Fedeli, is Associate Professor of Territorial Planning at the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies of the Politecnico di Milano, and she's also the President, she's been for 4 years now, the president of the European Urban Research Association. And among other things, Valeria is interested in processes of urban regionalizations and the trans-scalar character of the urban question in contemporary society. So thank you, Valeria. And maybe then our panelists could switch their cameras on so we can yes, great. Then second panelist here on my right, Julia Lenoé. She's a biogeochemist. I didn't prepare that, so I wasn't really sure how to say it. So a specialist of biogeochemistry, and she's held a first position at the world-famous Institute of Social Ecology in Vienna, Austria. She's now holding a temporary position at the geology laboratory of the none less famous École Normale Supérieure of Paris. Maybe a little less famous, but still it deserves its reputation, its high reputation. And so Julia is developing long-term socio-ecological approaches to model and to assess carbon stocks carbon stock shifts in forests at regional and national level, and carbon cycles more generally, so to speak. And sorry. And our third speaker, Fanny Lopez, also on my right here. Fanny is a historian of architecture, and she's associate professor here in Marne-la-Vallée at the architecture school. So she's a professor, associate professor of history of urbanism and technology, and she published several books already on energy autonomy and the transformation of large infrastructures and their challenge, so to speak, faced by those large infrastructures. And last, Simon Marvin, so he will also switch his camera on, I hope. Yes, he will. Simon, or his beautiful shirts that I'm so jealous of. Simon is a professor at the University of Sheffield, and he's heading the Urban Institute there. And Simon has written extensively on cities and infrastructures, and he's now interested in robotics and their urban implications, but he also works on urban control environments and many other things. Anyway, you will have a chance to learn more about our panelists, because they will now share with us some short presentations. And the first presentation will be that of Valeria. And Valeria has a presentation on shifting spatial organizations and spatial imaginaries in the after the COVID-19 crisis, if we admit we are already after the COVID crisis. So, but in fact, we're talking about the future, so we don't know how near or how distant this post-crisis future is, but Valeria will surely end with some optimistic message. Anyway, Valeria, the floor is yours. And you should switch your mic on, because we can't hear you.
Okay.
Yes, now we can. You can use the full screen mode or the. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really happy to contribute to this colloque, to this roundtable, celebrating the 10 years of LabEx Futurs Urbains. It's a really nice opportunity to share some research ideas and also to discuss in the eyes of the future, as it was just said, also for possible further reflection in the cycle of seminars organized by LabEx. And when Olivier invited me to contribute to this morning, I proposed him to start a conversation about a recent research proposal, which I've been submitting to the National Research Minister. So it's not yet a research which has started, but it's a in theory research. So really happy also to, let's say, collect some feedback on this proposal, which we hope will be funded. But anyway, this is part of a more general reflection and more general research activity that we are undergoing in the under the Roof Lab, Research on Urban Futures Lab, that together with Sandro Balducci, we have been leading at Politecnico di Milano, Department of Architecture and Urban Studies. And maybe I will come back to some projects that we have run there during the discussion. But today I would like to focus this short contribution on this research proposal and its main, let's say, its pillars. And the pillars are these three question or statements that you can find this short summary. The research proposal is titled Plastic or Elastic, which is the space future of space in the post-COVID world, what is happening to space and specialities in the post-COVID situation and the urban world. The second point of my presentation will be about the spatial turn in social sciences as a major contribution to understand crisis, and in particular understand COVID-19 crisis as the latest in a series of crises, so not just one crisis, single standing in the landscape. And third, I will try to introduce some elements from transition studies that in this proposal we consider further support to understanding the specialities of post-COVID, and in particular what is happening to cities in a large definition of the object city in the direction of urban and urbanity. So let's start with the first and major question: what is happening to space in the post-COVID world? Of course, there is a big debate about how COVID-19 has worked on space, restructuring it. Since February 2020, when the inhabitants of Wuhan experienced from the windows of high-rise buildings the crisis of everyday habits of the 21st century urban world, we all have been experiencing a world of separation as well as hyper-proximity that has drained out streets, squares, parks, and malls, filling in our flats and rooms of all the objects and practices that make everyday habits and expectations about consumption, leisure, culture, and work. We moved from the idea that we need a critical reflection on the pandemic as a social and environmental fact formed and grounded in space. And so space is central, and so far in our understanding, the spatial dynamics have been just observed very superficially, while we need to understand what is happening to space. Of course, we are also convinced that COVID-19 pandemic is not bringing in completely new effects or spatial dynamics. Many of them were already peeking out since a few decades as the effects of renegotiation of space within a cycle of deep economic restructuring of capitalism all over the world. But in this 1 year and a half, more than 1 year, disconnecting and distancing our daily life from the fruition of urban space, we had almost the impression that the urban world can apparently work in the absence of the city. And build more than ever on the overcoming of distances through virtualization of reality. In simple words, space appear ready to get organized and adapt to new economic models, the rise of smart working, distance learning, acceleration of growth in e-commerce, crisis of real estate, new desire for rarefaction and low density are the epiphenomena of what is happening, and we can read through the chronicles of this last year and a half. So it looks like we are escaping the city in a certain sense, and that work without the traditional role of the urban in an urban world. What we know, of course, is that this has generated social differentiation. Distancing has opened to exacerbation of forms of inequalities, new cleavages and fractures. Some operational landscape and practices have appear, nevertheless, less compressed and less possible to compress than others. Inequalities related to access to digital and technological infrastructure, for example, capacity of using them have appeared, so much so that some people have been more locked in than others. What we want to stress with this research project is that the COVID-19, however, is the most recent in a series of crises due to the restructuring forces of capitalism, which altogether have produced an ultimate form of capitalism that is indebting the future of society, as Paolo Perulli very nicely defined it. All in all, what is important in this research proposal is the idea that these processes have put inherited and entrenched social reproduction mechanism and their spatial temporal fix, that's what we are working upon, at risk, and the urban in particular. According to some observers and scholars, we are entering, for this reason, in a period of massive social experimentation. Private actors, household, business, the professions, and the public sector seems to be all in a game of experimenting new ways to govern and shape and channel their futures. So anti-urban practices have emerged, public policies have turned back to their fundamental, for example, questioning the role of proximity and density. Basically, the research tries to understand if this is what we should expect, real experimentation and a future that is really different from what we know, or maybe if the future was already there and now COVID-19 is putting in front of us some major signs of it. So the three questions of the research are the ones that you can see here: how and to what extent distance and proximity are being reshaped and renegotiated, according to which logics in concrete social technical arrangements. Moreover, which is the distance between current consolidated spatial imaginaries and the trajectories of change that have been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. As I will say in a while, we are basically observing that our spatial imaginaries are still quite outdated, and public policies in particular are working still on quite outdated spatial imaginaries. And so the first question is, which conceptual and methodological challenges this poses to public policies and planning as they have been conceived so far? Based on these questions, we have proposed in this proposal to look at spatial turn in social sciences as a way to restructure our understanding of the crisis. Of course, the spatial turn has been central in conceptualizing all sorts of crises, so it should be central again in our attempts to understand the reconfiguration of space that we should expect by after COVID-19. What we notice, however, is also that the spatial turn has been less effective in reshaping the policy-oriented reflection, in particular on the urban dimension of social organization. And we still rely on manifold, often normative, spatial, and in particular urban imaginaries that are produced by experts and based on an outdated understanding of the challenges proposed by the literature. For these reasons, we try to adopt the idea that the methodology of transition study as a strategy to explore post-COVID-19 spatiality. Why and how? Transition studies use a multidisciplinary approach to study the unfolding of transition and how they should be advanced. So the idea is that according to transition studies, COVID-19 does not amount to disruption in a given socio-technical system if no more than one system dimension alters for enduring long-term transformation. So we are trying to understand if COVID-19 has been really able to change social and spatial practices so far, or only the infrastructure we use to implement them. So we have digital learning, but did it change really the spaces for teaching, for example, and the practices of technology. And this is, of course, objective is to contribute to transform socio-spatial practices in order not to waste the crisis generated by the pandemic. Space has often been left behind in transition studies, according to our understanding. So this is also an opportunity to test transition studies in accounting the role of space in transition. And we are proposing that space could be a very crucial point in transition study, more than it has been so far. So coming to some conclusion, and that are the starting point of the research, what we are expecting to do, and so this is a sort of also methodological proposal that would be happy to discuss in the roundtable through the eyes of the others speakers and the public. We are trying to understand how we can produce a multi-level, multi-phase perspective on crisis, moving from destabilization, emergence, and institutional change, trying to explain disruptive systemic change, looking at different factors that undermine so-called regimes. So dominant and stable configuration in a societal system, stressed and exposed to the need of change. Among these regimes, space is a very crucial element. Transition studies looks also very interesting in developing a non-linear, multi-level, multi-domain, and co-evolutionary analysis of factors and effects of change. We want to understand, to take into consideration the interplay of a variety of changes at different levels in different domains and their interaction. And finally, in this research proposal, we also put forward the idea of not just having a desk study or a traditional study, but also visioning exercises that are proposed by transition studies as possible transitional arenas, drivers for innovation. What does it mean? Trying to build arenas of networks of actors, trying to facilitate and empower them to act strategically towards transition, producing visions that can motivate, coordinate, and empower actions in the short and medium term. Maybe in the discussion we can go deeper in this perspective that to us complements the idea of the traditional analysis with a more participatory, would say, process under which we try to build arenas for change and transition that can, let's say, offer opportunities for transition governance. So basically, that's from my side as for this first round.
Thank you very much, Valeria. A lot of input, either on how to conceptualize change, on spatial theory, and as well on methodologies, and I think they're very, very valuable for the conversation we want to have. So before we start this conversation, we have 3 more panelists to go. So the next panelist will be Fanny, and I don't know if we change seats or if I move your slides. Or...
Peut-être que tu peux les changer si ça t'embête pas, mais c'est peut-être pénible.
Non, pénible, non, je suis pas sûr que t'arrives vraiment.
Non, je...
Come along. Sorry about this little time lapse. Fanny.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Olivier, for the presentation. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about urban and infrastructural futures. As Olivier said, I'm working on energy infrastructures in transition, and more specifically about electricity. And since 3 years, I'm working on the electricity and territorial impacts of data centers. The energy density of these boxes has no equivalent in the history of urban planning. Data centers are disruptive to local energy systems, and their accumulation in urban areas as they are spreading in rural worlds are a big concern for spatial and electricity planning. The hypothesis and results presented here come from 2 research projects carried out with the Paris Region Institute for l'ADEME and for RTE and ENEDIS. In this research conducted with two colleagues, Cécile Diguet for the first one, the ADEM one, and the other one with Maximilian Gavlik, we have analyzed the destabilization that data centers have had on the absorption capacity of the local electrical systems and the response of the public authorities in some American and European cities. National or rather local public policies have adopted and implement measures to promote or, on the contrary, slow down this digital growth, like in Amsterdam. We discussed the prospects of energy pooling, on-site electricity production, or heat recovery promoted in an attempt to optimize the energy balance. Today, to get straight to the point, as the time is short, my hypothesis is the following. The digital infrastructure is the electrical infrastructure that seeks a new specialization and a new technical organization. This is the power station, one of the beating hearts of the digital electrical network of the future. This idea of a data center as a new electrical power plant is not just a GAFAM vision. We can also see it coming from other digital players like Equinix or other one. The data center will produce renewable energy on site with microgrids that will connect the surrounding buildings to its own backup and infrastructure reserve system. It will also make its waste available to the surrounding area. This is an example of the AgriPort data center hub in the Netherlands. In the ADEM report, we were shown how the large GAFAM operators are reconfiguring and sometimes replacing the electricity production and distribution operators with on-site power stations and microgrids connected to the large grid, particularly in the USA, where the liberalization of the electrical market has been extremely strong. This is also this example. This is the example of Microsoft in Wyoming. Microsoft share with the local power company Black Hills their data centers backup gas generators to produce electricity during grid peaks. The digital network has a double, the electrical network. With digitalization, their infrastructures are tending to merge more and more, even though, firstly, the public operators of the electricity network have no capacity to act on the digital sector. And secondly, the public dimension that historically constitutes them is being drastically reduced and therefore limits their ambition to provide public services. So what kind of network for this digital electrical infrastructure of the future? How do these urban imaginaries of the futures relate to visions of infrastructural futures? I will now go back over the crisis and the fragility of the large technical system of electricity, which has been highlighted and discussed for several decades and more by several researchers. Because of the crisis of the LTS, large technical system model, are diverse and often correlated, technical, political, and environmental causes. So what are the infrastructural future at stake? It seems to me that there are three main ones. The first one is the LTS reinforcement. As the world's largest cities face rising consumption and difficulties in meeting the electricity needs of the digital sector, the large technical system imagination dominates the operational world of planning and network operator. Examples include the data center parks program in Stockholm that was developed since 2016. This municipal project combine energy, digital, and real estate strategy on lands belong to the city, served by a heating and cooling network from the Exergi municipal company. Stockholm proposed a long-term lease to data center operators to set up, offering them free cooling in return for their waste heat. So in this case, the public services is very strong and so well structured. Another example is in Amsterdam, faced with the uncontrolled growth of data centers. The city of Haarlemmermeer and Amsterdam launched in 2019 an initiative to stop the construction of data centers in the metropolitan area. The aim is to take a break to better integrate them in the future, and an unprecedented amount of expertise on the subject in the Netherlands was produced. Commissioned by the public authorities, the studies are the result to an association between energy operators, data center industries, and urban planning departments. And in parallel of all the municipal reflection, a national reflection is underway on the location of a regional electricity pocket of 1 gigawatt. The LTS imaginary of the urban future corresponds to the vision of the infrastructural future. They are co-constructed with a very strong public commitment. So in this case, the LTS model works. In France, it's more complicated. There is no national or regional strategy for the moment comparable to this example in Stockholm or Amsterdam. The public electricity operator like RTE and Enedis for distribution and transmission are destabilized by the private data center operators who are overbooking megawatts. That means conflict of use in electricity. And there is a dissociation between the promoted urban imagination and the infrastructural reality that struggles to meet electrical needs of the digital sector. So the future of digital and super connected Île-de-France region is being promoted, but what about the infrastructures? It's a question. Regarding to discussions that we had with RTE and Enedis, we can imagine that the track LTS reinforcement will be chosen. However, two major alternative visions of the future to the LTS model are shaking up the infrastructural sector, and I mentioned them quickly in conclusion. The first has its origins in the counterculturalist trend of cybernetic, and it's also strongly marked by the decentralization of infrastructures, the distributed peer-to-peer mode, the search for commonality and energy sobriety. We can mention the example of Guifinet in Barcelona, created in Spain in 2004. Guifinet is a free, open, and neutral internet network having over 30,000 active nodes, totaling more than 55,000 kilometers in network link. Guifinet is a bottom-up community initiative aimed at providing a free Wi-Fi connectivity. And they are also considering the issue of their own data storage in a peer-to-peer mode. The second alternative vision comes from the smart city culture, particularly real-time management systems. In a more macro-systemic approach, it remains disruptive by proposing to reverse the historical hierarchy of electrical and digital systems. In this case, this is an example of this fascinating urban area in the Bronx, near New York, with one of the largest microgrid in the world. CHP gas station produce 80% of the electricity, and it's managed by a local energy cooperative, which is in battle with the incumbent electricity operator, because the operator, General Electric, charges them an extremely high price for the backup connection to the grid, even though the local production serves the company, General Electric, at time of high load. In this case, and in this conflict, we can imagine that microgrids can become the primary networks, and the large network become a secondary system of backup and solidarity. That's an idea that is discussed at the time in New York with the electricity operator. Unlike the classic smart grid or augmented technical macro system, which thinks the erasure or self-sufficiency of a certain part of the electrical system as an adjustment variable for the large network, the co-op city microgrid make optimization on local scale the priority of a technical system whose perimeter could be extended. I don't have the time, but this is the subject of an article to be published in a wonderful book directed by Caroline and Olivier.
Right.
So I finished. So the LTS imaginary remains very strong despite other imaginaries, which, despite the local successes, are struggling to establish themselves as the mainstay of the digital future. I stop here, but the discussion will be continued. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fanny. It was a great talk and plenty of input for our conversation. I now give the floor to Simon Marvin, who might also want to share a presentation. So I'll first close. Okay. And here's Simon's presentation already coming. Oh, great. That's great. And then you need to switch your mic on. No, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, excellent.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for the invitation during the workshop, and I appreciate the speakers doing their talks. It was really nice to hear about this fascinating work. So what to do was, when the asked me to participate, I was trying to think of, so I've approached it with colleagues, Aidan Weil and Rachel McCrory. We've been doing some work around a post-smart cities agenda, looking at sort of the element of artificial intelligence, autonomous systems and robotics. And what I wanted to do, if I can change my slide, here we go. I've sort of thought, well, how might we use the fellow Olivier set us to think about how might we go about understanding the implications of yet another round of sort of techno-economic trajectory of change in the urban context. What might be different ways of thinking about the urban future implications? And what I wanted to do was, it made me reflect on a set of work that's completed around what might be called smart or computational cities. And this was really trying to understand how a particular software package called an urban operating system was sold, versions of these urban operating systems were sold by numerous software companies, IBM, Hitachi, Microsoft, just to name three. And what was interesting about these software packages that underpin the vision of the smart city was that these were not new. These were software packages that had actually been developed to service the corporate sector. They were a form of software called enterprise resource planning. And that antecedent, that technological antecedent of this particular product, had really important implications because it envisioned the city as a digitally enabled corporate entity. Without going into detail, the vision that Smart was really about the reconnecting of every element of urban life together through data and software, a sort of vision of the city as a system of systems. And this was very similar to the vision that sold to large corporate entities. It claimed that these ERP systems would be able to seamlessly connect together human resources, logistics, purchasing, sales across the entire corporate entity and generate insights and knowledge that would enhance the adaptability of the corporate entity. And the city was seen almost synonymous with the corporate entity. But actually the reality was very different. The reality was that due to the level of fragmentation of ownership and control, this idea of seamless integration across every domain, infrastructural and social and institutional domain of life was not realisable. And what actually happened was the fragmentation of this operating system into much more discrete forms of functionality. Important but discrete. And the vision of the integrated urban domain was never realised. I think what was important about that work, which was undertaken with my colleague Andreas Lucael at Durham, was that looking at the antecedents of what was seen as a technological revolution in the urban domain was really important as part of the analysis of trying to disentangle what was really happening in terms of the dynamics and the way in which the urban condition disrupted this very singular vision of the digitally enabled corporate. And what I wanted to do was try and think about what insights that might have if we were to do a program of work around urban AI, automation and robotics. And we've done some preliminary thinking in this in papers published in Urban Studies and Urban Geography. And really, what's really interesting, we're on yet another roller coaster of new claims that are being made about another technological transition that is supposed to transform urban life. But it's very interesting looking at what's differences between this and the smart city picture. So if you want to look at some of the visions that have been painted, the World Economic Forum have done quite an interesting set of work around agile cities, preparing for the fourth industrial revolution. And he makes this argument that a set of fourth industrial revolution technologies that include artificial intelligence, robotics and autonomous systems are going to transform urban life. Very much like computational systems of the smart city will meant to transform urban life. And already you can see the rhetoric of this. They've undertaken a conversation to make sure ourselves are fully prepared. And the question of why do this, and the benefits are, but the inevitability that we should catalyse change and share best practices. And I think as one of the other earlier people mentioned, this is spawning a landscape of experimentation. The systems and technologies that have a physicality, they have a kinetic, their importance because this is no longer solely about computational. It relies on computation and data, but it's actually also linked to mobility, physicality and kinetics, and different sorts of combinations of the use of autonomous vehicles, service robots, and delivery vehicles. It's all about also about the extension of AI into new domains of spatial monitoring and decision making. They're used in urban design. And this is actually a very different logic to the logic of the smart city. I think the relies on many of the systems of the smart city. But this involves new players, new companies involved in new sites of experimentation. So the first thing we could do to understand what it means for urban futures would be looking at the urbanisation of graphs, robotics and autonomous systems. And in an interesting review piece, Nagenborg looked about the robots are leading factories in urban space. And I think that tells us something about these are not products that are necessarily solely developed for the urban context. They're products that have had a prior use. They've been conceived in other contexts. And there's lots of questions that we would want to ask about this. Is why AI and robotics are being considered as relevant to the urban context? What pressures, what visions and imageries are being produced? Who are the intermediaries who are facilitating these forms of experiments in pilot zones, and what sorts of spaces are being configured? And as urbanists, we might want to know, well, what social learning is taking place, and by who, about how these systems might reshape urban life and the sort of spatial temporal configuration of the city. And one sort of response would be to look at emblematic and exemplary sites where these sorts of activities are being undertaken. One example would be Japan, which has a vision of trying to link its existing technological capacity, capabilities and innovation with a set of broader societal challenges around aging, utilising flagship events like the much delayed Tokyo Olympics, experimenting in special zones of exception actually, zones that can suspend novel forms of regulation, to experiment with robotic applications. And it's a fascinating landscape of experiments and might be informing of the ways in which the robotic might be intertwined in urban life. The other exemplar we might turn to is China, where a national innovation priority is to become one of the world's primary AI innovation centres, which is linked to a really extensive programme of urban experimentation. Cities and city regions are configuring themselves to pull down state resources, to work with universities and form partnerships with companies around experimenting with very intensively utilising AI in the government, service delivery, and also the development of platform technologies to manage high-density urban developments and infrastructure. And another example that particularly sticks outside the normal landscape when you think of smart cities and computationally enabled urbanism is the megacity of Neom in Saudi Arabia, which has made much of its use of automating driving, passenger drones, and the vision that repetitive and arduous tasks would be automated and handled by robots. You can see the way in which this is a city that wouldn't have large numbers of guest workers in terms of the claims that are being made about the ability of robotic automation to substitute the guest workers. You have this sort of really unusual landscape of these are different types of places, different types of companies that are becoming involved in these places. On one way is trying to excavate what we might mean would be a entry through the urban agendas, which we've started doing. But there's other ways of doing it. One of the ways I wanted to suggest is
2 minutes.
We might start a program of thinking about the antecedents of these systems, trying to trace the way in which they've developed and been applied elsewhere, not in the urban context. I think it's going to be important to understand the process of transmutation and the claims that the learning that's been undertaken and the claims that are being made about these systems. And some of the concepts that are really worth thinking about here is aviation. aviation has a long history of use of data, and many problems with data that reveal the limits of replacing human for machinic decision making. The military have been used technologies, and their use of them raises all sorts of ethical questions about the boundary between human and machinic decision making, including conflict. It's also very revealing of the limits of these technologies, the difficulties they've had of replacing soldiers with robots. There's many other sectors where these systems are applied. Mining, agriculture. I was thinking back to some really useful work that I might be able to do, to thinking through how these systems configured in one context. And I'm not suggesting that the logic and the rationality that underpin them simply transmute into the other context, because they don't. But what they do enable us to do is to think a lot more carefully about what might the blending of human and robotic interaction enable in the urban domain, with a better understanding of the limits and constraints of the applications of these systems in multiple domains outside the urban context. And the final thoughts I had, I was thinking, reflecting on looking at some of these exemplar cities that are investing heavily in these sorts of applications, and there's many others I might mention. One of the lessons of the smart city would be to try and think about how, as urbanists, we might want to be part of a conversation about extending social experiments involving these sorts of technological functionalities and capacities, to think a little bit more carefully about how we might enlarge the social interests that are involved. Looking at the very techno-economically focused priorities of many of the forms of transportation, they need to be disrupted and enlarged by trying to involve other sorts of social interests who are often excluded from the experimental schemes, artists, the elderly, children, green movement. And to think about the sort of wider set of societal rationales and priorities that might be addressed. I think one of the critical issues about the smart cities was that actually it was primarily a debate about efficiency, and only relatively marginal effectiveness and services. There wasn't particularly done for although significant case, particularly. And these sorts of experiments might enable us to different ways in which these technologies can be in ways not envisioned by the developers or the prior concepts of application. So finally,
very quickly, Simon. Yeah.
Very quickly. Yeah. These sorts of applications are limited, but they're becoming more coalition with interest. What orientation is very narrowly focused. So I think the issue for urban futures is how to understand these antecedents and enlarge the scope of experimentation, and I'll finish on that. Thank you.
That was quick on the last slide. Thank you very much, Simon. So we are now you even have applause I see on the screen, and now we have our final speaker, Julia. So please come near the computer before I wreck it completely. We're moving from highly technologized environments to biogeochemical cycles. So we'll see it's so distant from one another. And now, what shall I do? Should I do that? Perfect. I'm improving.
So yes, thank you also for inviting me at this Table-ronde. I'm very happy for that, also because, as you already said, I am a biogeochemist, so I am not with a social science background. However, I have a strong tropism towards the social science, and for me, this does not mean that I reinvented the wheel by doing what others have been doing for centuries or decades, but rather that I try to connect with the dialogue and use what is already in the social science with an anchorage in the biogeochemistry science. So I hope I will not disappoint you with this. So my talk will be about the scenarios in land use systems, in particular in Austria, which is here the case studies, but I've been also studying other cases like France and Europe. So what I will say today can also have other consequences or similar implication in other countries. And so this presentation will promote an interdisciplinary dialogue between territorial biogeochemistry and social science. So I will do this presentation in 6 parts. So I will first present the context and issues, then the conceptual framework I am using. Then I will take a short retrospective on the land use trajectory in Austria. Then I will present the modeling approach to design the scenarios and develop a quantitative assessment. And I will present the results from this modeling approach, and then finish with a discussion on how this scenario development can help us to discuss the possibility to re-embed the economy within land use and agro-food systems. So here is the general context of my presentation. So over the course of the 20th and early 21st centuries, intensification and specialization in the land use sector have enabled to virtually meet food requirements for a growing global population, increasingly living in urban centers disconnected from food-producing areas. However, these changes were enabled by an ever-growing dependence upon fossil fuel energy, an opening of the biogeochemical cycle, such as the nitrogen cycle with the invention of the Haber-Bosch process and the discovery of phosphorus mine in the middle of the 19th century, and global deforestation all over the world, while 870 million of people are currently still suffering from hunger. So in that context, the land use sector has to face a double challenge. On the one hand, it has to contribute to climate change mitigation and more broadly to ecological resilience, and on the other hand, to provide food in quantity and quality for a growing population living more and more in cities. So understanding this double challenge, I suggest requires to explore prospective scenarios and their greenhouse gas budget. Also, other environmental indicator might be interesting. Here, I will be more focused on this indicator of greenhouse gas budget. So the complexity of the issue of land use scenario design has been considered since the last 2 decades with the Millennium Assessment Model in 2002. And recently, in the last IPCC report, the Integrated Assessment Model, which you can see there, enables to grasp the interaction between the socio-economic, ecological, and climatic systems under possible future land use scenario. So this scientific approach and this presupposition have, however, been vividly criticized in a recent paper in 2019 by Anderson and Jewell, published in Nature, because the range of possibilities developed in the IPCC scenario is furiously constrained by the search for economic profitability and growth, whatever the scenario, even the more sustainable one. However, alternative approaches also exist, which explore the biophysical option space of possible scenarios remaining within social and physical planetary boundaries. And I argue that the value of these approaches is that they consider the market economic system as a set of historical institutions resulting from power relations and potentially subject to deep modifications in the future. This is not an intangible law, just as the gravity, for example. So in my presentation, I will illustrate this second scientific approach by investigating prospective scenarios in the land use sector and their impacts in terms of land use changes food provisioning, and greenhouse gas budget. So to do so, I will take Austria as a case study and raise the following set of questions. So what is the recent trajectory of the Austrian land use sector and its institutional and political drivers? So for that, I base my presentation on existing literature. This is not my own research. What is the biophysical option space for the land use sector at the horizon 2050, and how biophysically possible scenarios could be turned into realistic ones? So those two questions is a paper I am currently preparing with other colleagues. So to answer this question, I developed an interdisciplinary approach, bringing together quantitative assessment based on biogeochemical models and a socio-political analysis based on an explicit theoretical framework derived from Karl Polanyi's thinking of embeddedness. So I will now present this conceptual framework. So many of you may already know about embeddedness and disembeddedness from Polanyi's thinking, which in many ways is similar to the strong sustainability approach, which has been developed also in environmental and social sciences. So the concept of embeddedness is best suited for having a strong sustainability approach. It has been originally developed by Polanyi in its book, The Great Transformation, to describe the deployment of a market economy which increasingly consider production factors, so including labor, land, and money, as mere commodities in order to meet its requirements of self-regulation. However, according to Polanyi, production factors are fictitious commodities because none of them are actually produced in view of being sold. And considering them as commodities has resulted in disembedding the economy from the society and the environment. Therefore, according to Polanyi, disembeddedness of the economy refers to the movement of making the land, the labor, and the money some kind of appendices of a market, a self-regulative market economy. However, it is worth saying that also Polanyi originally opposed the embedded economy of pre-industrial or socialist economy to the disembedded economy of market society. In reality, any economic activity is always spatially, socially, and ecologically embedded. But the question we need to ask is where and how is this embedded? So in what follows, I will use these concepts to analyze and interpret how recent trends and possible scenarios of land use systems are tied to different level and type of embeddedness. So I will now use those concepts and use existing literature to take a short retrospective on land use trajectory in Austria. So, as you probably know, Austria is a European landlocked country in the cool temperate climate zone with a population of around 9 million inhabitants in 2019, and almost 60% of its people living in urban centers. So as alpine mountains cover a large share of the territory, only 31% of the territory can be used for agriculture and only 12% for cropland area. So 12% of the territory is dedicated to feed 60% of the population living in urban center, urban. To examine the possibilities of reorienting land use and agri-food systems in the next 30 years, it is worth considering their recent trajectories in order to appreciate the past dependency phenomena that could hinder or facilitate the actual implementation of the different prospective scenarios that I will present after. So in Austria, the current pattern in land use and agri-food systems are a consequence of the so-called modernization of agriculture and productivism paradigm, which was instilled in the post-war period and until the 80s by the head of the Marshall Plan as early as 1947 and then with the implementation of national modernization policies, which sought to increase agricultural production following the so-called Grüne Plan in Austria. So in the 60s and the 70s, following that plan, the main policy measures implemented were economic protectionism and restructuring of farming structure from, as you can see here, subsistence integrated crop and livestock farming. So we can see here that there is a ratio between cropland and grassland that reflects this low specialization in the 60s, also not completely absent, but then in the 80s and 70s, the farming system become highly specialized and export-oriented toward the crops or livestock production, as you can see on this little map here. So this new form of intensive and specialized farming system was increasingly dependent on mineral fertilizer, animal feed, fuel, pesticides, and antibiotics input. So then the emergence of the neoliberal era following the collapse of the USSR has contributed to a new wave of food commodification globally. And Austria is no exception to that rule, despite a significant investment of the public Austrian authorities in organic farming, so the most important in Europe currently. In the land use sector in Austria, this new wave of commodification has occurred through the progressive abandonment of protectionist policies. And as a member of the European Union only since 1995, Austrian agriculture has been subject to the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, whose objectives since the early 90s have been shifting toward the strengthening of the environmental regulation, but concomitant with a greater deregulation of agricultural commodities on international markets. And the entry of the Green Party to the parliament in 1986 also marked a considerable shift from a productivist and protectionist paradigm toward a more liberal and agro-environmental one. And this shift was particularly evident in the policies implemented by the Minister Joseph Riegler to reduce overproduction and environmental pressure by direct payments to farmers and subsidizing fallow, a strategy which has resulted in decoupling food prices and from agricultural costs. So this trend toward biomass commodification has resulted in a loss of spatial and ecological embeddedness because land use specialization foster meat consumption in Austria, but also in the rest of Europe, with very high land demand and environmental pressure. Also an increased biomass trade that is related to a loss of spatial embeddedness and a subsequent opening of the biogeochemical cycle and emission of greenhouse gas by the agricultural sector. Despite, in addition, despite civil and activist counter movements, the past trajectories from the 60s can also be seen as a loss of social embeddedness in land use system. So, as a matter of fact, the modernization of agriculture have resulted in halving the number of peasants, while the abatement of the customs barrier from the late 80s resulted in a fall of agricultural prices, which have severely affected peasant revenues, which also have strengthened the in-depthness and need for further specialization. So this pattern, as you know, is also very similar to the one we have in France.
2 minutes.
Okay, so I will try to be fast. So now it was said that the greenhouse gas net emission in the land use sector. I have, with other colleagues, developed the BioClimAT model and the CRAFT model, so which are biogeochemical model which allow to reproduce the greenhouse gas budget in agricultural and forest system, and to develop future scenarios and assess the ecological impact, and in particular the greenhouse gas budget associated to different scenarios. So the analysis of the past trajectories allow us to identify important socio-ecological drivers in the land use systems, so mainly trade balance, farming practices, and human diet and food waste. And in addition, so in addition, another potential
LabEx. Oh.
Il faut leur dire de couper.
Oui, coupez votre micro, merci. So yes, so to build the scenarios, we considered these main socio-ecological levers and built 36 scenarios defined by specific combination of variants of these socio-ecological drivers. So because I don't have so much time, you will see those different drivers on the next slide. No, not on the next slide, sorry. So, no. Well, this modeling approach allowed us to... je crois que mon micro est coupé. Est-ce qu'on m'entend? Non, oui. Bon. The modeling approach allowed us to estimate the greenhouse gas budget in 2010 in Austria. And with no surprise, we see that agriculture is a big emitter of greenhouse gas emission. This represents 11% of the greenhouse gas emission in Austria, so excluding emission from land use, so by the agricultural sector. And only the forest contributing to mitigate, to attenuate this greenhouse gas emission by absorbing greenhouse gas. And overall, the forest system does not compensate emission by agriculture, and the land use sector is currently a net source of greenhouse gas emissions in Austria. So how can this be changed? What are the possibilities? So here is the biophysical options page we have designed. And as you can see, so we consider different diets, different kind of trade level, so no trade or constant trade, different agricultural system and different technical mitigation. And the key results of this biophysical option space is that a shift in diet allows to open the range of possibility, because with the constant diet, the only possibility we have is to continue with conventional farming system and trade. So this is the only possibility. Otherwise, we don't have, there is not enough land, and there is too much greenhouse gas emission. So negative value here indicates sink. So attenuation of the climate, of climate change, attenuation of greenhouse gas concentration. So yes, diet allows to open the range of possibilities. If we look at what happened in agricultural versus forest systems, we see some quite contrasted patterns on the role of organic farming, because organic farming is associated to lower greenhouse gas emission in agricultural system. But because organic farming have a slightly lower yield than conventional farming, the carbon sink promoted by afforestation is lower under organic farming than under other conventional farming systems. However, the greenhouse gas budget is not the only aspect which matters in terms of ecological imprint and social equity. And consequently, shifts in physical trade balance and agricultural practices should be discussed following an integrative perspective, accounting for other environmental indicators documented in the literature, and considering the embeddedness of the economy within land use systems associated to different scenarios. So this is my last slide. I am about to conclude with this final discussion that I propose here. So the key result of this presentation is that changes in diet would allow to open the range of possibility to feed the Austrian population while contributing to climate change mitigation. So in Austria, the current diet is the result of past and recent agricultural public policy, which I have presented just before. And these past public policies will necessarily create a past dependency for future evolutions in the land use sector, with many techno-economic lockers which may hinder a shift toward less meat and dairy consumption. This includes land use specialization, dependence upon industrial input, and retailing lobby pressures. These lockers are rooted in a common logic of biomass commodification, resulting from market integration and market expansion of biomass products over the last 3 decades. However, the acceleration of the climate crisis calls for a reversal of priorities, and the interlinkage between shift in diet, agricultural practices, and biomass trade in past trajectories of land use and agro-food systems suggest that the necessary change in diet in the future must be understood as integral to a reconfiguration of trade and agricultural practices. So the present analysis pleads for a shift toward a strong sustainability paradigm aiming at mitigating climate change by ecologically re-embedding the economy in land use systems, closing the nutrition cycles at the local scale by spatially re-embedding the economy in land use system, and providing affordable quality by ecologically re-embedding the economy, socially re-embedding the economy in land use system. So as shown by the present result, climate change mitigation implies to diminish the share of meat consumption, both to reduce greenhouse gas emission from agriculture and to save land for afforestation. Closing biogeochemical cycles at local or regional scale would certainly require us to implement trade regulation in order to minimize the externalization of the environmental burden. And providing affordable, high-quality food implies to promote the conversion of conventional farming systems toward more extensive organic farming, which have many positive impacts despite the crop yields being lower than in conventional farming systems. So I conclude with this last sentence. I argue that such objectives for scenarios in the land use system imply a vision of the world in which land and biomass products are seen as common goods and are decommodified, that is, to reverse the metabolic rift already seen by Karl Marx as early as 1867, and then also shown by John Bellamy Foster, to reverse this metabolic rift with an epistemic rift, at least an epistemic rift in science. Thank you, and sorry for being so long.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, as expected, we now have less than an hour for our conversation and discussion, but it is kind of general rule in when you give people so little time to present, they usually cheat a little, but it's all for the good. So thank you very much, and thanks to all our panelists. And so now we come to the second part of the round table, which is kind of asking to all panelists questions that have been raised in each one of the presentations, and so I will start from the beginning with Valeria's presentation. And one interesting point, there are many interesting things in Valeria's presentation. I'm sure many of us, at least on the panel, could discuss for a long time on the power but also on the caveats of the transitions approach. But this will reserve for another time, or maybe there will be questions on these issues, on this theoretical framework later on. But I would rather like to pick another question, which is the role of crisis in exploring the future. And of course, the COVID-19 crisis has been, so to speak, interpreted as a revealer of the future, and there would be, and there would have been, I don't know how we should say it now, there would have been the world before and the world after the COVID-19 crisis, and now that we start seeing the world after, it doesn't seem so different from the world before. But at the same time, crises do reveal things, and one of Valeria's arguments is that the COVID-19 crisis has revealed spatial transformations that were already at play, but only in a low-intensity way, and so they were not so easily observable. But my question to the other panelists then would be, and to Valeria, if she wants to comment on that point, would be to ask, do you consider that crisis can be a sort of laboratory of urban futures? Under what conditions, to what extent, in particular, do a crisis create special circumstances in which future configurations can be glimpsed at or observed or even experimented, because it creates a kind of an open configuration. So I don't know who else. I have to turn back to the computer because we have two panelists further on. The remote panelists, so to speak. So who would like to comment on this idea that crisis can be a window onto the future, and under what conditions, or is it illusionary? Any clue, anyone on that issue? Simon, yes, please.
It's a really interesting question, Olivier, and I think actually, if you look back over the last 15 months, you've seen many ways of thinking about urban futures that have been revealed by the crisis. You saw quite early on the death of the city was announced, and COVID had melted the logic of densification and living in close proximity. The rebirth of the city was signalled about 6 months after that. I was very interested to see how the urban condition was reported, actually. And then there was this burst of ideas about different urban, the building back better, and lots of ideas about the way in which we might want to configure socially and materially urbanism. And yet the paradox, I think, is that the crisis has revealed more about the past in some ways, about actually it's revealed all sorts of issues about the way in which pandemics are not novel or new, that they happen at the moment. It revealed a lot of obduracy in terms of the inflexibility of dealing with social inequalities. It's like a time machine. It's like a kaleidoscope. It feels like the crisis has pushed us backwards and forwards. And that actually, it feels to me, in the urban technical domain, there was this technological solutionism that was represented through technological applications that have shown to be much more problematic. I really do. I don't think it's done one thing, it's done many things.
Thank you, Simon, for a kind of Gramscian perspective on the crisis. So, because as Gramsci would have said, the crisis is when the old is dying, but the new cannot be born easily, and we are in a way in a period of such crisis. Valeria, did you want to add something, or? Okay.
Yes, maybe. I hear some echo of feedback, but I hope you hear me. Maybe one consideration is about the fact that space is one of the hardest regime to change. It takes a lot of time, so path dependency is evident, and even more in urban, in spatial imaginaries. This path dependency is very strong. But so I agree on the fact that the crisis has revealed the past in a way. Maybe the past, very recent past, because through the crisis we have understood, for example, more and more how the digital world is reshaping also space, as in the first presentation, I would say, or how robotics and artificial intelligence are rethinking our cities. It has become an issue of more public debate, let's say, because we have seen the importance, not the importance, but the strength of this change over our lives. So, on the one hand, crisis can unveil regimes, but of course they are not necessarily able to change them. We need some spaces of innovation that can really then become practices. So embeddedness, I would say, is still a crucial challenge. So I'm pretty much looking at crisis as a way to reveal the possible futures, but of course first of all, crises reveal the limits of the present and how the present is already moving towards the future, and how this future is already here, and with some conflictual forces that it's not easy to fight in a way. So I agree with you, the role of crisis in exploring the future is crucial, but it's also a role in exploring the recent past and the main forces that are reshaping contemporary world, let's say.
Thank you very much. I don't think our two other panelists would like to comment on this specific point at this stage, maybe later on, but we can relate this question of the effects of a crisis, so to speak, to the second question I wanted to raise also primarily in relation with Fanny's presentation, because Fanny emphasizes the role of competing imaginaries and visions of infrastructural futures, and their potential influence on the direction of infrastructural change and their performative role, so to speak. And we've seen that the COVID-19 crisis has to some extent unleashed imaginaries, but my question here would be more social imaginaries. My question would be more on social technical imaginaries, trying to explore or to ask the panelists about how they see the role of imaginaries, socio-technical imaginaries in actual socio-technical developments. How do visions of the future, of urban futures, of technological futures, emerge? How they are promoted in more or less favorable cultural contexts that prevail, and how are they made tangible, credible, legitimate, or in a way, is there a kind of specific role of imaginaries in future technological development? Because in the example that Fanny presented, she concludes by saying that the imaginary of a large technical system still prevails largely, but it's obviously it's not only the imaginary of the large technical systems, it's also the vested interest of the large companies that support this system. So how do those articulate, and in socio-technical change more generally? Who would like to say a few words, Fanny?
Oui.
Yes.
En français, alors je veux bien.
In French, and if needed, we'll translate.
Ok, merci. Oui, alors c'est aussi relié à la question de la crise. Finalement, il y a pas mal de liens parce que, et si je reviens peut-être sur ce réseau du Bronx à New York que je trouve super intéressant parce qu'il est réapproprié à travers plein de discours et même l'État de New York dans son service énergie, Louis Serdal le mobilise beaucoup, mais sans pointer la dimension problématique, c'est-à-dire d'autres modes d'interconnexion possibles, qui est vraiment le fer de lance de cette opération qui bataille avec la compagnie historique. Et on voit qu'on a des imaginaires techniques, cette figure du micro-réseau, elle m'intéresse beaucoup. Alors elle est aussi liée, et à la fois je parle de réseau électrique et de réseau numérique, de leur lien, vous l'avez bien compris dans mon intervention, aussi parce que les opérateurs de data center participent à développer cette figure et à essayer de l'affirmer, ou en tout cas à l'imposer d'un point de vue des imaginaires urbains, sans savoir trop dans quelle direction et de quelle façon le système électrique pourrait ou pas se recomposer. Et ce qui est intéressant avec cet exemple du Bronx, c'est que il fait suite à une crise, c'est suite à l'ouragan Sandy qui a eu lieu, il y a quelques années, quelques décennies maintenant. Le quartier a été déconnecté pendant plus de 72 heures. Ça a été un des derniers quartiers de la ville de New York à être reconnecté au réseau électrique. Et il se trouve qu'en parallèle, il y avait un projet de rénovation urbaine qui était en cours. Et donc la coopérative s'est mobilisée pour installer une centrale de cogénération, changer des moteurs parce qu'il y avait déjà une centrale de chauffage urbain. Et donc autonomie électrique à 90% dans le quartier. Donc un micro-réseau, le plus grand micro-réseau privé du monde, qui est le résultat d'une initiative locale. Ils ont aujourd'hui des ambitions de faire des systèmes de phytoépuration, ils réfléchissent aussi à des questions liées au numérique. Enfin, ça prend énormément d'ampleur d'un point de vue de la gestion des systèmes énergétiques et peut-être demain data center, pourquoi pas, on ne sait pas, ça c'est moi qui présuppose, qui parle au futur. Mais je trouve que cette figure du micro-réseau, elle est vraiment intéressante. Et on a d'autres exemples à New York. On pourrait prendre celui d'Hudson Yard, qui là c'est l'immobilier de luxe, on est peut-être plus dans une dynamique splitting urbanisme. C'est une autre histoire, alors que la dynamique Co-op City, c'est vraiment refabriquer du service public à partir d'un cas très localisé, donc à partir d'un objet technique micro-réseau, on voit qu'on a des imaginaires très différents, et la ville de New York aujourd'hui, dans son programme, parce qu'elle soutient le développement des micro-réseaux, même à l'échelle de l'État, pas juste de la ville, ce micro-réseau de Co-op City est souvent cité en exemple, mais ce qui porte politiquement et aussi d'un point de vue des lobbies, etc., n'est jamais évoqué dans les textes, alors que il est connu pour ça, pour faire ses sessions, pour cette volonté, ses combats, etc., etc. Donc à travers un objet, on voit là que ça part un peu dans plein de directions différentes, et peut-être comme ma réponse un peu, mais parce que c'est vraiment très compliqué tout ça.
So Fanny emphasizes in a way the idea that imaginaries can be materialized locally when they face such a strong vested interest of large industries, large technological systems. There still are possibilities to materialize alternative imaginaries locally and then hopefully make them spread. That would be a tactic, but case studies show that even in different locales, in different places, the microelectric grids carry with them very diverse imaginaries, and which is also interesting. But they manage to carry them into actually existing systems. And I think that's a very interesting point, and a very way of looking at the future, maybe potential future emerging locally. Valeria, would you like to comment on the spatial imaginaries that you emphasize in your own research?
Yes, that's I was reflecting on 2 points listening to Fanny's presentation and also reaction. On the one hand, I really appreciated the way in which Fanny may merge the coupling of two different actors, which become an hybrid in a certain sense. Because the energy actors and the data, let's say, actors seems distinguished, but they join the examples that she's providing. And what I think is interesting is the fact that this is happening more on a technical level than maybe in the imaginary spheres. So cities have a hard time, as she said, to understand that this is happening and this can happen, and this, when happening, can also produce interesting hybrids, spatial hybrids. So on the one hand, we still debate about production of networks in a very traditional sense, and so hinging on spatial imaginaries as a traditional art infrastructure of the city, but we are more and more in a production of infrastructure that is implicitly, let's say, producing new spatial imaginaries that are hard to be grasped by cities. So it's difficult to find cities where this kind of coupling and its potentialities is under investigation. In Italy, I haven't heard such things as the ones that she has shown. I would be curious to investigate if there is any example of that kind, but I mean, the emergence of such hybrid actors makes it clear that they could be, let's say, activators of new spatial imaginaries that are still far from our municipalist, for example, idea of public utilities, but still relies on a very traditional idea of an infrastructure that produces public goods. The access to electricity and energy, the access to water, and the access to mobility infrastructure. And I think this is an element that would really contribute to move from socio-technical sphere to a social construction of new imaginaries for the urban. That also would change a lot our governance ideas about the urban. So I really appreciated these examples and the conceptual challenges related to the presentation.
Thank you. I was also struck by your idea of the outdated, so to speak, imaginaries of decision makers that have not made a spatial turn in a way, and that still rely in their way of thinking about space and of acting upon space with old-fashioned, outdated schemes that do not reflect the contemporary functioning of spaces. And obviously, some imaginaries have are better positioned in a way to get a hold on reality. So this kind of time lapse between the imaginary of spatial decision makers and what we know about how space actually functions today, I think is also very worth reflecting upon. I had a tricky question to Julia about the imaginary of vegetarianism, because, or at least dietary change, but it's so tricky. I'm not sure I can even ask it. But my question would be something like: is it a kind of food imaginary that drives people to vegetarianism, or is it other forms of imaginary? For example, their understanding of environmental equilibrium or disequilibrium. Would you have anything to say on that, Julia?
Yes, that's true. Well, I hope I have something interesting to say about this, but the imaginary around vegetal food, I would say, come from two kinds of source. One source is the material interest. So, of course, I believe that vegan and vegetarian movement are mostly the fact of rather young people or from the young generation, and the fact that vegetarianism is increasingly seen as a way to struggle against climate change it is no how would say that hazard that young people who will be the most impacted by climate change are the ones who are the most involved in this food activism. So that is one source, and then of this food imaginary. And then the other source of food imaginary, I think, is it's the political project, because you may have a material interest, but you are not always aware of this material interest. So this is one thing, the material interest, but another thing is the idea how you translate something that you are concerned by into a project. And imagination, I believe, is always a project, and a project is always a political project. And so then after the material interest comes the ethical vision, and the ethical vision can be for the future generation, the humanity to remain in a safe ecological boundaries. But for example, in the vegan movement, it is also about the animals' welfare, no, not welfare, sorry, the animal health and well-being. Thank you very much. So this enlarge the mere question of food and of human health. This is a political project that is increasingly large, since it even concerns the non-human. So I think, yes, this is the two sources of imagination, material and ideological.
Thank you. The answer was much clearer than the question, which is very nice. But also in terms of food, there is we have the impression to observe a kind of time lapse or distance between what people would be ready to accept or even willing to promote and what decision makers in fact do. And at least in France, there are huge debates about should we have vegetarian meals in the schools. And you've got all sorts of positions. We have no time to discuss that, and some arguments are really very, very poor. But one aspect is that it seems that the decision makers are behind what in fact the people would be ready or even eager to promote. So that's another way of time and distance between decision makers and other social actors. Simon, I don't know if you want to react on imaginaries or no. Can you hear me? Well, we can maybe turn to the next question, which it's a point that is raised in all presentations, but I would pick it from Simon's approach to urban robotics. It is how do you what kind of methodological approaches, whether established or innovative, can you use to explore potential urban futures? And one example is given by Simon with his urban robotics, arguing that robotics have been used in other domains before, and so we have at least a partial understanding of what they do, how they are appropriated, robotic technologies, how they are appropriated by human counterparts, so to speak, and maybe this experience we have of use of robotics in other areas and urban management can help understanding what it will do to cities and to urbanites. And I think this idea of looking at elsewheres or else times to try and track the potential future effects of a technological development is a very valuable approach. What do you all do? So maybe Simon wants to comment on how I read his approach, and beyond that, how do all of you do to kind of explore the future in methodological terms? Do you think the future is always present somewhere, or in the present, or do you use kind of methodological approaches and ruses, tricks to explore it? Simon, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thanks, Olivier. I really like the idea, the antecedents, the existing context. When we were doing this program of work on trying to understand the smart city, it was really important to engage with software developers and companies who were developing these products, which was revealing of a really interesting literature in critical management studies. And I think what's interesting about it as a methodology is that as urbanists, I think there's ways in which we can sort of refresh the repertoire of our own thinking and research design and techniques by sort of slightly looking outside at in this case, critical management studies. And critical management studies have done a lot of work looking at the application of large-scale computational systems to corporate entities and the absolute problems that entailed in delimiting the flexibility and adaptability of corporate entities. In fact, they described computation in one fantastic book as electronic concrete. And it was a study about the way in which the computational systems embody assumptions about the social and material organisation of the world, and can be really problematic in the way they deliver that. And I think actually, as urbanists, that we could probably do other sorts of try to find other sorts of collaborative work in other domains that have looked critically at the contribution and application of new technological functionality, because it could be really informing, I think, in quite novel ways of the sorts of issues and questions that we need to be asking when these often in economic crises, the systems are sold into other contexts, and the urban context appears as a market. I think, it's challenging to do, but I think very worthwhile.
Thank you. Any other input on methodological issues? Of course, but then maybe we can discuss the relations between social science, more inquiry or investigation-based approaches, and more modeling approaches, and how the two can articulate. We can discuss it, because my last question has to do with interdisciplinarity, so we can address that, which is of course one important dimension of the response, because other scientific approaches are much more easygoing, so to speak, with trying and projecting future trends, and there is I think interesting space for social sciences, or for inquiry-based sciences and model-based sciences to work together to improve both approaches when exploring the future. But let's keep that maybe, or unless you want to react on that now, or on other methodological aspects. Julia, do you?
I'm happy to react on I'm just saying I'm happy to react on the question about the future being already there in the present or not, because I think this is a very important question, and for me I think it's important to say that contrarily to what many our philosophers have been saying, that there might be an inevitable march toward the future, whether it be towards communism, whether it be toward rationality, according to Marx, or according to Hegel. I am more in favor of what Buravois say in a recent article, that there is bifurcation in the present, and that different possible futures are already present now, but which future will see the rise depend on an intersubjective process whose final result cannot be completely predicted by the so-called objective condition. These also result from the ethic debates, and how the politics is present in a democratic way, so that everyone can defend its own or group. Different group can defend their own vision of the world and interest, material interest, but also ethical vision. And so methodologically, I think this also echoes to what Eric Olin Wright say in one of his last book, Real Utopia, that science, to be emancipatory, has to criticize the world as it is now, then imagine potential desirable future, and then identify obstacles and how to pass over these obstacles. And this requires to make the science transmittable and accessible to the largest, as large as possible, to enable a real democratic action and debates.
Thank you very much. And yes, for Olin Wright, it had very specific methodological implications, which is to deliberately focus on projects that seek to change the world more or less radically. So instead of having a more kind of sample sociological approach where you try to account for all various tendencies and power relations, etc. The idea is to focus on where people, projects try to really change things, and in a way it goes to what Fanny has presented. Even if microelectric grids do not change large technical systems now, they're worth looking at because they tell a lot on how this could happen in a way, and maybe the conditions upon which it could happen.
Non, c'était très bien dit, non, non, j'étais très intéressée par ce que tu disais aussi, et c'est vrai que je trouve que la dimension très située des choses, alors je ne sais pas comment, il faudrait regarder les travaux, faire un peu l'état de l'art là-dessus, mais j'ai l'impression que ça a pris une place assez importante ces 10 dernières années, peut-être, pour penser un peu les alternatives et la façon dont les historiens, tout un tas ou même d'autres champs mettre tout ça en perspective. J'ai l'impression qu'il y a eu quand même un peu une montée de cette approche, de l'approche située. Mais ça, je ne sais pas, il faudrait peut-être en débattre. Et je pense aussi, alors il y a tout un champ aussi intéressant, et c'est un lien avec ce que tu disais un peu précédemment, sur les approches contrefactuelles et les futurs non advenus en histoire. C'est Quentin Guillermoz aussi qui travaille là-dessus, et tout ça est aussi beaucoup en lien. Hier on parlait de science-fiction aussi et d'utopie. Et pour ce qui est de l'histoire des techniques, malgré tout, on voit qu'il y a quand même une ligne assez précise qui se déroule depuis la fin du 19e. On a eu tout un tas d'alternatives à différents moments de l'histoire. Pour le cas très français, Tipo, que j'adore citer souvent, a bien montré aussi ça pour le modèle DF. Enfin, il y a quand même une forme d'homogénéité, et aujourd'hui j'ai l'impression que les approches situées que les chercheurs, chercheuses mettent peut-être de plus en plus en lumière, contribuent peut-être à participer, alors c'est peut-être pas à imposer, mais en tout cas à donner de plus en plus de place à l'idée de la diversité infrastructurelle, où en fait je me demande comment cette notion, peut-être dans le futur, arrivera à s'imposer et s'inscrire, puisqu'on est sur des Mumford qui parlait de techniques autoritaires et démocratiques déjà dans les années 60, et ce qui caractérisait la technique autoritaire, c'était le fait qu'elle soit homogène, et que la voiture électrique aurait pu exister au début du XXe siècle, mais non, on a d'autres modèles, les lobbies et toute une histoire qui a fait que non, le moteur sera thermique. Aujourd'hui c'est le contraire. Donc vraiment cette dimension très unidirectionnelle et très homogène, et la façon dont la diversité d'autres modèles qui sont mis en perspective, notamment par les approches situées, me semble aujourd'hui une piste assez intéressante.
So the hope for the future lies in local, in places, so to speak. We just have to look for it with new Googles. Valeria, unless you want to comment on this methodological issue, would you like to? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Very quickly, because time is going by. And I was just proposing you at the beginning this idea of visionary exercises, and I totally agree with Fanny. Thinking about the future is a social learning process that is necessarily situated. It's a process in which individuals maybe start to relate to a broader common context and ambitions, and then create conditions for diffusion, self-organizational processes, emergent innovation to take place. So in our approach, we build on these example. For years we've been working on scenario making, situated scenario making exercises. Of course, they're just small pieces of the construction of critical construction of future visions, but from urban studies point of view, I think they collaborate, let's say, in producing visions for futures that can also generate change and more critical transition, let's say.
Thank you. And indeed, time is flowing, and we but still, well, I suggest we take a few more minutes for a last short exchange on the potential of interdisciplinarity for exploring futures. And as I said before, I'm really grateful to Julia for coming to talk with social scientists, because we've had this reflection on the construction of urban futures, especially among social scientists until now, and I think input of other approaches is very valuable. And just to take maybe an oversimplified example, we can talk for a long time between social scientists on the different changes that would be required to promote more sustainable futures. But your approach, for example, the research you presented here, says that if we don't change diet regimes, we can't make it. Whatever, based on current knowledge on agriculture and food production, we can't make it if we don't change our diet regime. And I think that can be used as not a starting point, but as an element in a reflection for social sciences to move forward from a debate that could eternally turn around, should we fly less or eat less meat, or in fact maybe we have to do all of them, but the kind of results produced by these approaches is very useful, I would argue, for us social scientists. So in fact my last question was about interdisciplinarity and how social sciences and other disciplines could most benefit from each other. Any experience to share among the panel? Actually, we can use the last few minutes among panelists, because no question was put on the chat. So we can use the 5 last minutes of this roundtable to have a quick exchange on these issues, if you like. So who? Good. Okay, Julia.
So I think first that interdisciplinarity with the social sciences is also very much needed for people working in experimental sciences. I start with that. Then I want to say that maybe what is very interesting with interdisciplinary approach in environmental sciences is that the materiality of the world, whether it is ecosystem or ecosystem like forest or agro-ecosystem or urban system with different degree of anthropization. So that this materiality always responds to biophysical laws. Even human bodies responds to biophysical laws with the respiration, digestion, or whatever. But then the agency of the bodies, of the materiality, and even more at a large spatial scale, this agency of the fluxes is driven by social logic. So, for instance, the evolution of the land use in France has been guided by the willing to modernize agriculture, the willing to have an export-oriented agriculture, but also to develop the industry and then to develop a urban place to build the tertiary economy. So if we miss that point, also the experimental scientists, the climate scientists, completely miss the historical dimension of materiality, and this is a very big problem, because then we have this idea of Anthropocene with the humanity in its role, like entire humanity being responsible for climate change, while this is absolutely wrong. But this is not even questioned in many cases, just here, and we don't suppose that maybe this is well, there is the book by Christophe Bonneuil that probably you know, the Anthropocene event where he questioned this, but he questioned it also as an historian. And this is very, very welcome in the debate, but I think this should be more present also in environmental sciences. And yes, I think that sometimes probably the social scientists also miss the ecological dimension of history. Like history also have ecological dimension, and that the historical change in land use system have affected the ecological functioning of forest, the soil fertility. Soil fertility is a historical process, but it's also a biophysical fact, and we have to account for the somehow autonomy of the biophysics, because if humans are absent of the earth, then the bacteria will keep doing their bacterial activity. They will do it in a different way, with a different agency of the fluxes, but they will keep living. So I think there is an extreme richness in having this cross-disciplinary exchange, but this has to include a real person, because and this is why I'm so happy to be there, because you are a real person, I am a real person, but this cannot be in the absence of one of the two parties that interdisciplinary is possible.
Merci. Bon, moi toujours en français, désolé, je ne vous ai pas fait mon mauvais anglais pour la réponse. Non, je me posais la question, enfin, à partir du champ de l'architecture qui est plutôt le mien, comment la perception des objets techniques peut-être un peu évolué. Ça pose aussi la question de l'interdisciplinarité, parce qu'on a souvent aussi ces débats en école d'architecture, quand on parle de réseau, peut-être plus que d'infrastructures liées aux problématiques smart city, sur toute cette dimension, comment dire ça, ces objets techniques qui ont été très longtemps réservés à des systèmes d'experts, quand on est vraiment dans la filerie, dans toute cette ingénierie urbaine, j'ai l'impression que c'est revenu un peu dans le champ de l'architecture, notamment grâce, entre guillemets, à des disciplines un peu autres, comme la socio-anthropologie, que ces disciplines-là ont aussi participé à ramener dans le champ de l'architecture ces questions techniques. Bon, c'est pas très bien formulé, je vais réfléchir à ça, je trouve que c'est très intéressant.
The importance of material environment and what we make of it in scientific approaches in our research project. But I think really, I agree with Julien. The key point is that we are in tradition of in social science where we argue that human societies and human agency have a capacity, indefinite capacity, to shape their own environment. And it's very difficult for us to include in our analysis the idea that some parts of the environment are just radically external to human agency, that you cannot do everything you want with the material or ecological environment. And I think this has strong, profound implications on how we consider social change, for example. Valeria, Simon, you are also real people, even if you are not with us. Would you like to say a few concluding words, Valeria? Okay.
Well, about interdisciplinarity, of course, this is crucial. And what I can say, I am professor in a Politecnico, which means that it's the basic of our daily life and research to be interdisciplinary. But just in recent times, we have really tried to work out spaces for interdisciplinarity, which is another very important issue. So, for example, now we have under the initiative of the rector, transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary groups that try to define research challenges that oblige us to produce some sort of trading zones between different disciplinary real research. So I'm I'm part of a transdisciplinary group that is called Data. It's just one of the names. There are many others, but our main objective is to find out problems that can engage us, can challenge us from different disciplinary background, to speak a language that is not so much complicated to speak, but helps looking at problems in different ways and making research in a very different way, which is sometimes very hard because it takes time and you see the outcome maybe in the longer term. But I think it's one of the most interesting challenges that we are facing. This opens very interesting spaces.
Thank you. And so, Simon, you will conclude. I remember that you worked a lot with engineers and people working with models, and then, in my understanding, but maybe I'm wrong, you withdrew from those collaborations, saying that in the end it didn't prove as helpful as you hoped for what you wanted to do in terms of urban technology research, including future-oriented urban technology research. So we'd like to comment on that and conclude.
Yes, I have a strong commitment to interdisciplinarity, but I don't think it's. I think it's something that you can. The way in which an interdisciplinary collaboration is constituted is critical to the work it might do, and the space, as Valeria said, to do that opens and closes. The social sciences are often seen as doing a very narrow part of interdisciplinary collaboration, which is a disaster for the project and a disaster for the social sciences. But so I think the space can open and close over the course of your career. I mean, I actually think the need for it is more intense than ever before, actually. Looking at the domains in which ecologies are becoming, ecological reproduction and biological reproduction, the domains of life that are becoming automated and roboticized are in agriculture, forestry, maritime environments. Some of the most intensely datafied and technologicized environments that are exploited through technological systems are outside the urban domain. And unless we engage in collaborations within agriculture, maritime, mining and resources, even weather's really interesting as well. We're not going to find the sorts of solutions that we're required to make the sort of critical ecological and climate-related questions. But how to do it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our panelists. It was a very rich conversation, and we will keep going in the following months, and as I said, in the following academic year, where we plan to have several events and several seminars on these issues. So all of you will be very welcome to contribute one way or another. But I see the director of the LabEx is now sitting near me. Would like to say a few words, a few final words, so I give the mic.
Thank you, Olivier. Thank you, colleague. Je vais faire en fait ces mots de clôture en français. Donc on a convenu de faire une clôture relativement courte, évidemment. Donc je commencerai tout d'abord par remercier les intervenants, les intervenantes, les animatrices et les animateurs des 7 tables rondes qu'on a entendues depuis hier et qui ont fait de ces 10 ans du LabEx, je crois, un événement scientifique relativement dense et très intéressant pour tout le monde. Je remercie évidemment la direction du LabEx, Bruno Tassin, Roberta Morelli, auquel j'associerai Olivier Coutard et Frédéric de Coninck, ici présents dans la salle, pour nous avoir aidés à monter ces 10 ans et les avoir orientés d'une manière, je crois, satisfaisante. Je voudrais dire un mot aussi aux personnes du campus numérique du CIPEN qui ont filmé en fait ces 10 ans du LabEx et qu'on pourra donc mettre en partage sur le site du LabEx très prochainement. Je pense que ça sera utile pour toutes celles et tous ceux qui n'ont pas pu assister à l'intégralité des 10 ans. Je voudrais aussi enfin remercier Nathalie Gambini qui a assuré la logistique de manière impeccable dans des conditions qui ont été difficiles, je l'ai dit hier matin, et je pense que tout le monde en était très très ravi, ça s'est très bien passé. Alors ce que nous voulions faire... Ce que nous voulions faire à travers ces 10 ans, c'était montrer le LabEx en action, et c'était aussi parler des futurs urbains après 2020, sans pour autant transformer les études urbaines postérieures à 2020 en Covid Urban Studies, sans prétendre qu'il allait avoir un pandemic turn de la recherche urbaine. Alors malgré tout, la Covid était quand même parmi nous. Je crois qu'il n'y a pas une table ronde qui ne l'a pas abordée. On sent que ça pèse et on sent que ça interroge. Et de fait, je pense que ça va nous interroger encore pendant quelques temps. Moi, je voudrais retenir simplement 3 bonnes nouvelles pour la recherche urbaine à travers ce qu'on a entendu depuis 2 jours. La première bonne nouvelle, c'est que malgré la Covid, malgré la crise, la fatigue des chercheuses et des chercheurs qui sont fatigués du Zoom turn, et ce Zoom turn, malheureusement, il est bien possible qu'il reste encore quelques temps, je pense que la recherche urbaine, elle est toujours vivante, live and kicking, comme on pourrait dire, pour dire en fait qu'il y a derrière du potentiel. La deuxième bonne nouvelle, c'est que cette recherche urbaine, on l'a vu, elle est très dynamique. Elle est très dynamique pour peut-être 4 raisons. D'abord parce qu'elle contribue au débat public, ça a été dit dans plusieurs tables rondes. Ensuite parce qu'elle pratique une interdisciplinarité de qualité qui va jusqu'à l'interdisciplinarité radicale. On l'a vu dans la dernière table ronde, mais ça a été aussi évoqué à plusieurs reprises. Une troisième raison, c'est que la recherche urbaine est capable de s'interroger, elle s'interroge en permanence sur les méthodes qu'elle utilise, sur les concepts qu'elle véhicule, sur les données qu'elle produit. Une quatrième raison, c'est que cette recherche urbaine, elle est aujourd'hui, en 2021, tout à fait apte à pratiquer de nouvelles technologies de diffusion, et ça a été dit hier en fin de matinée. La troisième bonne nouvelle pour la recherche urbaine, je pense que c'est qu'on a affaire aujourd'hui à une recherche urbaine qui est performante et pas du tout déclinante, comme on pourrait le croire. Il n'y a pas de crise, il n'y a pas du tout de crise de la recherche urbaine, bien au contraire, elle est très performante. Elle l'est pour 3 raisons. D'abord, on vient de le voir parce qu'elle est internationale, et le LabEx est un dispositif qui permet de renforcer l'internationalisation de la recherche urbaine. On a fait plusieurs fois le tour du monde depuis ces 2 jours. Elle est performante parce qu'elle est très rigoureuse du point de vue épistémologique. Toutes les chercheuses et tous les chercheurs qu'on a entendus se posent des questions épistémologiques et prennent le temps de développer cette épistémologie avant d'avancer leurs hypothèses et leurs résultats. Enfin, elle est performante parce qu'elle est éthique. Elle se pose toujours la question de l'éthique. On a affaire à une recherche qui est citoyenne, et c'est sans doute l'une des différences par rapport à il y a 10 ans. Cette question éthique, je crois qu'elle est montée en puissance, et on l'a vu apparaître à plusieurs reprises dans ces 2 jours. Alors, le LabEx joue évidemment son rôle, je pense, par rapport à cette recherche urbaine performante. Ce rôle, c'est de la soutenir notamment dans sa part expérimentale. On l'a dit à plusieurs reprises, le LabEx, ce sont 14 groupes transversaux collaboratifs et une plateforme collaborative. Je pense que ça peut être aussi autre chose. Ça peut être aussi un camp de base, où l'approfondissement thématique ou l'approfondissement disciplinaire peut se ressourcer à l'interdisciplinarité plus générale. C'est l'objectif du séminaire Construction des futurs urbains qu'Olivier Coutard a lancé au début de l'année. Ça a été l'objectif des LabEx Week, c'était l'objectif aussi des 10 ans, et je pense que c'est utile de faire assez régulièrement, sans en faire de trop, un moment scientifique de ce temps-là où on peut se ressourcer les uns les autres en écoutant, en partageant nos différents terrains. Alors pourquoi c'est important? Parce que je pense que la recherche urbaine, elle doit aujourd'hui partir à l'assaut des défis urbains de notre temps, pour lesquels, on l'a compris, c'est peut-être le dernier mot de conclusion, pour lesquels les chercheurs ne peuvent plus rester dans leur tour d'ivoire et seront forcément des acteurs de ce qui va advenir pour les futurs urbains. Merci et à bientôt.